Hello, I'm Robert Ellsberg. I'm the publisher of orbisbooks. I'm very glad to be joined by one of our new authors today, Howard Snyder, who is the author of this book, Francis of Assisi, Movement Maker, The Unconventional Leadership of a Simple Saint. Howard Snyder has a doctorate in historical theology from Notre Dame. He is an ordained minister and ordained elder in the Free Methodist Church who has taught in various seminaries and pastored various churches. He's the author of numerous books. He's a great expert on mission, Wesleyan studies, and church renewal. And all of those streams really enter into his new book about St. Francis, probably the most popular saint of history, whose example often has like a kind of spark, has traveled across long distances and centuries, sparking inspiration, conversion, and renewal right up to the present day. In the Catholic Church, we're very aware of that with the adoption of the name Francis by our current Pope, who clearly in choosing that name was thinking of St. Francis and taking him really as an example for a present-day renewal of the Catholic Church. Many of us can remember very clearly when St. Francis came into our lives. For me, it was when I was in high school and happened to just discover for myself a copy of the Little Flowers of St. Francis on the library shelf, not really knowing that St. Francis was a really famous person. And I read this book and I was just amazed because I thought that saints were just these sort of pious, perfect people in stained glass windows. And I had no idea that here was a saint whose life and holiness was based on really trying to live like Jesus, and what that might say to us about our own mission and path of discipleship. Howard Snyder can also remember his own discovery of St. Francis. You mentioned that growing up, you knew a lot more about John Wesley than you did about Francis. But at some point you came across his story, and there lie the seeds of the present book 20 years later. Maybe you could tell a little bit about that and what inspired you to undertake this long, deep immersion in the life and mission of St. Francis.
Okay, yeah, sure. Thank you. I'm glad for the opportunity. Growing up in the Wesleyan denomination, I was very aware of the Wesleyan movement, Wesleyan revival, and I became interested early on in movements of the spirit. There's all kinds of movements and all kinds of spirits, but particularly the way spiritual movements have been a primary way that the church receives and experiences new life. So I knew about Francis in that context. I never read really anything about him except what I'd run into coincidentally. But in 1980, I published a book on John Wesley and the early Methodist movement, and I began to think about how does he compare with Francis of Assisi, about whom I knew very little. So I thought, well, if I ever get to Italy, I want to visit Assisi. Well, we had an opportunity, my wife and I, in 2003, to do a tour of Italy, and so we spent a couple of days there in Assisi, or a couple of nights. And I was so fascinated with the story and with the town and so on that I thought, well, maybe I could do, I'm not sure we need another book on Francis, but maybe I could do something from a little different angle, more like I did with the Wesley book. So I wanted to tell Francis' story, but I wanted to also tell the story of the movement and what the dynamics of it were and so on. And then I wanted to ask the so what question. What can we learn today, personally and as the church, in its broader sense? So that's really what I try to do in this book. Three things. One, who was Francis? Understand who he was, how God worked in his life. I call his conversion in 3 acts, a drama in 3 acts. And then why all these young men, and then later Claire, young women, why all these young men wanted to spend time with Francis, and then so and how he formed the community, and then why 12 people within just a very short number of years grew up into 5,000 people, and they're beyond that. So, and then I ran across this book, I think back in 1970, The Origins of the Franciscan Order by Esser, which is who's a Franciscan, and he raised a lot of the questions, dealt with a lot of the issues I was interested in. So that just became an important source as I got into that. And then I wanted to know, well, I knew from church history that the Franciscan movement very early split into various streams. And a lot of problems with it. And I viewed that negatively, but I didn't really understand it. So I wanted to understand that. So I traced the history. I felt it was necessary to trace the history on through the next three or four centuries. And of course, there's all kinds of interesting stories there. And I was particularly fascinated with the question, how did this young man with very little education end up with followers who were some of the leading professors in the universities, within 50 years of Francis' death? I mean, it's amazing. Oxford and Paris and a number of others as well. So, and that all, of course, ties in with the birth and growth of universities in Europe. So that was where the genesis of it. But I wanted to bring it to personal application as well. So most of the book is understanding the movement, what was happening, and so on. But the last chapter or two, as I've told some of my friends, I went from history to meddling. So what's this mean for us? And I was fascinated by this idea of being a lesser brother, and with the Clares, lesser sisters. And by the way, I try to tell her story fairly completely in the book. So the last chapter I call Lessons in Lesserness, and it really is saying, what is here? If I really want to follow Christ, what is here? What can I learn from Francis? And that's sort of a synopsis of the book.
Many saints have set out to form a new model of religious life, or to reform an existing model, such as Teresa of Avila. Francis is kind of unusual because his conversion entails this message he receives from a crucifix in this dilapidated church, saying, Francis, repair my church. He takes that very literally at first, and kind of rebuilding this chapel. But really, that was the mission that was given to him, to renew and repair the entire church, which had fallen into a kind of ruin. So he's a perfect model for your kind of interest in that question of church renewal.
Yes, definitely. And two aspects of that. One is Francis felt a very specific call, and it meant that he wasn't going to be a Benedictine, he wasn't going to follow some other order. Even when the church hierarchy tried to get him to, almost force him to adopt, the Benedictine orders or one of the others discipline, he said no. So because of the sense of developing a community that would maintain this emphasis on servanthood, basically, we would call it today probably. So that was one thing. So it's a movement, therefore, very much around Francis' own spirituality. And then the second part of that, of course, is Francis' attraction to all the living creatures. His canticle of the creatures, I think, is wonderful. It's short, it's profound, it's easily remembered, so his sensitivity to all living things. And in the book, I try to place that within what's going on in the larger culture as well. In other words, on the one hand, lot of folklore about animals. On the other hand, there were some new scientific discoveries, but he very much wanted to relate this to the creative act and love of God, and God who communicates with us communicates also with the other creatures, and we can have some communication with them, which coincidentally is exactly what science is discovering today. I mean, there's a lot of interesting scientific discoveries about animal communication and all that kind of thing. So, so I think that that's where the uniqueness lies. It is in the strong sense of community, not bound by rules, although there was an overall structure, of course, and particularly the importance of the heritages, which I really didn't know about, but I got into that in the research. Not bound together by rules, but bound together by a common commitment to Francis, but most of all to Jesus. And what does it mean to literally be a follower of Jesus today? And I nuance the fact of the context of the time, the spirituality of the time, the culture of the time, and all that kind of thing. But still, the uniqueness of this movement, which the dynamism of which is proven by the fact that this contagion of following Jesus in a costly sense of community has continued right up to the present time. It's amazing, really, not with an emphasis on the structures so much, but with an emphasis on relationships, really relationship with God, relationship with the created order, with one another. So that's I think what I try to contribute.
Well, it would seem to me that, aside from community, that what Francis was offering was on the one hand, his servanthood, serving the poor and the sick, but also this radical poverty. That was one of the most striking things that departed from the values of his culture and of the church at the time. And then, of course, there was something incredibly appealing about him, that he exuded this kind of joy and happiness and freedom, and that made young men in Assisi and young women then take a different kind of look at him. That he offered a kind of way of life that was liberating and renewing.
Yeah, it was radical in the context, particularly this age of the beginning of commercialism, and business was really taking off. Commerce, emphasis on wealth and fame and so on. And so Francis' very intentional adoption of radical poverty and a life lived differently. The interesting thing was it appealed to young people. and that's partly the dynamic here. It was a radical movement, and young people, probably more of the middle-aged and older people, are looking for real meaning in life, and they're more open. I know this is a broad generalization, but I think all down through history, they're more open to some new radical challenge. Of course, that can be good or bad, but I think it was the integrity of Francis' life and love, and as you say, his own, I call it his charism, his way of relating to people was attractive. And what they found out, once they made this radical commitment to give away everything, essentially, then they were bound to each other, and they had made such a radical commitment that they had cut the ties with a lot of the surrounding values of the time, but still maintaining, connection within the church, which Francis was very concerned about. He didn't want to be understood as a heretic, and he didn't want to be a heretic. He wanted to keep this dynamism within the church, which incidentally is something that John Wesley was concerned about as well in the early Methodism. So having made that radical commitment, but yet committed to the liturgy and the sacraments and so on, they had a way of maintaining a vital life that continued to be attractive. And I tell some of the individual stories of some of the brothers, and a little bit with some of the sisters as well. That once for all radical commitment to poverty then set them apart and brought them together. But of course, later, as I point out in the book, some of the brothers begin to question this. Was this too extreme? And so they had big debates over how literally they should follow the rule that had been approved by the Pope and so on. So I try to deal with all of that in the book.
Well, yeah, so in an incredibly short amount of time, as you say, he starts off with a dozen followers, and then before you know it, there are hundreds and there are thousands, and a kind of Franciscan fever just sweeps across Europe, and it really is, as you say, a kind of countercultural movement that has a lot of appeal for young people. That idea of an emphasis on a certain quality of life rather than upward mobility and just having more and more and more success, following the example of their parents or whatever. Because a lot of wealthy people who were attracted to this and became from well-to-do families, and even then, princesses, began leaving their castles to want to become followers of Clare and Francis. And then that's the fascinating thing that you trace also, is what happens over time when you have an idea like this that is rooted so much in a kind of charismatic personality, and one who also exhibits such a radical kind of anti-institutionalism and freedom and spontaneity. How do you sustain that? And how do you not just fritter away? And that's one of the interesting things, the tensions that introduces, and how those are reconciled or struggled with within the movement over time.
Yeah, and I think that I call it the unconventional leadership of a simple saint. There really was a profound insight in Francis in the way he developed the movement. He understood, there were a lot of heretical groups of various sorts, extreme groups, and on the other hand, there was a lot of corruption in the hierarchy. He recognized that, and the Pope recognized that. So he understood if he was going to live out this radical life, he had to have, shall we say, cover from the Pope. So that whole story of how he gets the approval of Innocent III, of course, it was portrayed very dramatically in the film Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, with some liberties, of course, but the basic story is true. So that meant he had this overall protection from the hierarchy to do the thing that he was doing, which otherwise could have been seen as heretical. But what he was wanting the people to do, as young men to do, was not to follow him, but to follow Jesus. And so I think what makes this particularly relevant movement today is it's not a question of, okay, let's follow Francis. It's a question of saying, well, who is Francis following? What insights did he have? And how do we translate that into our time? Which then means it has application not just to Catholics, but to Protestants and any who really are fascinated enough about Jesus or about Francis, who leads them to Jesus, to say, I'm gonna do that too. So I'm feeling that call.
You mentioned before that there were kind of literal kind of divisions within the movement, within just generations.
Yeah.
And you had those who wanted to more strictly follow Francis's example of literal poverty, and those who wanted to make various kinds of compromises for the sake of institutional stability, or just because they felt that it was humanly impossible to adopt that kind of model. So you had this kind of dialectic that got very heated, even violent at times. Yeah. And yet you said that in the beginning that you were disturbed by that or thought that was a bad thing. But in some ways, those kind of impulses, it's sort of like the kind of energy within an atom or something like that, of kind of, or negative and positive sort of impulses that have to be reconciled or kept in a kind of productive tension, rather than splintering or one kind of dominating or suppressing the other. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. That's a good analogy. I mean, that's an analogy from the created order, and other analogies, and they're really more than analogies from the created order, have to do with just the way life develops in the creatures. Sometimes there's attention and so on, but behind that, life is seeking to break forth. And that's where wisdom, of leadership comes in. It's very interesting that Francis quickly saw within 20 years or so or less leading the movement that he couldn't control this movement. It was become so big. So he says, I'm going to resign as leader. I'm just going to be an example and a teacher. And that looks like abandonment of responsibility, but actually it allowed him to continue to have this influence by a moral influence, a spiritual influence, rather than primarily authoritarian organizational movement. But yeah, if you're Bonaventure, for example, who became was a contemporary with Thomas Aquinas at the University of Paris, or others who are Franciscans with this vow of poverty, but they're also teaching in a university. So is it all right to have books? What about other equipment that you might need or not? So I detail how that became a big controversy in the movement, and partly is what led to split and then new movements coming forward. But behind that always is this person and charism and spirit of Francis that just continued on as an ideal and as a motivating factor, whatever the controversies were that they were working through.
Well, I find that a really fascinating subject beyond just the Franciscans or renewal movements, but for the question of the church as a whole, how to keep in balance that kind of the charismatic, spirit-driven kind of principle and the institutional or structural, and that if the charismatic overwhelms, things can fly off in every direction. But if the institutional is too strong and squashes that inspiration, then it becomes authoritarian and pathological in its own different kinds of ways. So you could almost look at the whole history of the church. And and this brings also into your interest in comparing John Wesley and Saint Francis as renewal figures.
Yeah, definitely. And the comparison between Francis and Pope Innocent III is very interesting. Pope Innocent III, probably the most influential pope during the Middle Ages, he knew there needed to be church renewal. He was proposing it. He was working for church renewal. But that included institutional forms of various, included the Crusades, which Francis certainly was not in favor of. And by the way, I have a chapter dealing with Francis' own ministry to the Muslims. So the Pope was aware that he could use this power of this new movement and keep it within the church. So there's a kind of a back and forth there, but Francis was just going to do what he felt the Lord called him to do, and he did it all his life and died in poverty as he wished.
Maybe you could jump ahead to those to the last chapter there, where you talk about apart from renewal movements, what can each of us lessons we can take from Francis, and lessons in lesserness, as you say. Yeah,
well, I think the main thing, central thing, obviously, and must be the central thing, is commitment to Jesus Christ. Just as the one, we will follow Jesus and what he told us to do. And then, of course, then raises all kinds of questions that have to be dealt with. But that's the first thing. But there are other things. I try to show that a radical following of Jesus doesn't mean abandoning the church. Quite the opposite. There is a positive synergy, symbiosis between this radical following of Jesus, which must always be first, and recognizing that we have the values of the liturgy, of the sacraments, of the written word of God, of the Christian tradition, and so on. So what I try to do in that last chapter is say, okay, start with this radical commitment to Jesus, which has been the spring of every significant renewal movement down through history, in my view, within the church. Start with that, keep that central, but then realize that other people before you have followed, have walked in this way. And so what can we learn from them and from the tradition? Of course, that includes hymns and poetry and various sorts of traditions and literature, you know. So I try to focus on those kinds of things, but beginning to end, the sense of we are on a journey with Jesus, open to the Holy Spirit, within the fellowship of other brothers and sisters in Christ, and just allow the Lord to continue to work with us, considering what we can learn from Francis. My idea here essentially is that in this journey of seeking to follow in the Christian way, Francis can help us at a number of points, and that's what I try to bring out in the book.
Did you have a feeling in writing this book that in some way you were introducing Francis maybe to a Protestant audience that is not so familiar with saints and St. Francis in particular?
Yeah, very much. I had in mind, you know, I studied at Notre Dame, but I did my dissertation under a Mennonite, John Howard Yoder. And I've all my academic career, I've been very interested in this kind of interplay between charism and institution and different forms of the church. And I think both Catholics and Protestants primarily see Francis as a person of personal spirituality that we can learn from. But I wanted to bring in this whole movement dynamic. And I think that's relevant to both Catholics and Protestants, or even other groups. But in particular, most Protestants know very little about Francis, except the kind of the iconic things. If they've read anything, it's probably the Little Flowers of St. Francis, which was written 100 years after Francis and got some historical problems with it. So I try to get to the best sources and show as best I can what we reliably know, pretty much securely, from the earliest sources about Francis, and introduce that to a range of audiences, particularly Protestant, but I think Catholics will also find things here that they had never been aware of.
Well, I think that's one of the appealing things about the book also, is that there's a sense of your own excitement in kind of discovering this story, and finding that it actually builds on and extends interests that you've pursued throughout your career. But it's extraordinary, the range of scholarship that you draw on here. And as you say, you go into stories about Franciscan mission, and I won't get into it here. Genghis Khan makes an appearance.
Yeah, Genghis Khan, Columbus.
Yeah, that won't go into right now. But the book is filled with a kind of discovery and excitement about your subject, which I think you will communicate to anyone who reads this book. So I want to thank you very much for joining me today, and urge everyone to read this wonderful book, Francis of Assisi, Movement Maker, which again, just even in the title indicates that this is not just a hagiographical account of the story of Francis, but an aspect of a way of looking at him. What made him so successful? What were the kind of challenges and dynamics that he set forth? How are those resolved? What can we learn from that? Not just from Francis as an individual and as a holy personality, but about that kind of impetus of for renewal in the church and how we can learn from it today. So thank you very much, Howard. It's really been a pleasure talking with you.
You're welcome. I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk more about the book and Francis. Okay.
Thank you.
Mhm.